become more responsive to the people's demands. On the other hand, America will continue also the fight against Al-Qaeda. If there are human rights violations involving that fight, America can justify its actions as basically defense for its national security, or basically the reliance on extra constitutional measures was somehow justified. It's a long debate. We hope that the human rights record in each Arab country and in the countries in the whole region can improve, but I believe that the publication of these reports is a positive sign in itself, and definitely there's a concern by every government, including the United States, addressing whether Saudi Arabia or any other country about their human rights policy. So I believe it is an improvement from previous years, from the first years that followed the September 11 attack, whereby basically it was a case of international concern over certain groups. But if you have a policy to fight terrorism and also a concern about human rights, I think this is a good policy. But also we hope there can be great improvements in human rights record, and hopefully no such publication can reveal all these cases of treatments, executions, whatever.
Well, Wafiq Mustafa, let me ask you this. Given the record that Saudi Arabia has had in terms of what it has exercised in its own kingdom, and given the fact that only condemnation, and that's about it, has been stated from different rights organizations across the board, do you think that because of that Saudi Arabia feels that it can send its troops into Bahrain because they think, well, over the past 20, 30, 40 years, not much has been done in terms of the international reaction of exercising any type of restrictions on Saudi Arabia, so they feel it's okay for them to go into Bahrain. It's okay for them to exercise whatever rule of law which they seem necessary, one of them which is against international norms, and that is these military trials that are taking place. 4 already been sentenced to death.
Well, that's true. In the real world, Saudi Arabia can get away with many things, with murder, with abusing human rights. And the human rights record in Saudi Arabia is appalling. There's no escape from that. Having said that, there is no elected parliament or elected council in Saudi Arabia. They all appointed, and the women's right is virtually nil. And women are actually very hardly fighting for the rights either. It's a quite paradoxical situation, because it's going to bring some problems and responsibilities too, that you have got about probably 70,000 young Saudis are educated in the West, and it will be very difficult to be able to hold the values, the Western values in democracy, freedom of speech and fairness, and then you return back to the country and to trying to adhere to medieval type of life and code of conduct. And so I think you're going to have a big problem in Saudi Arabia, and it's a matter of time. And I think it's very matter of time. So if you go, people like to live in London, but like to live in the way people lived 7th century or 8th century away in Arabia.
Well, in terms of the time factor, let me ask you this. We know that the leading members of the Saudi royal family, I mean, most of them are in their 70s and 80s, and even some analysts have said, aside from what is happening in terms of this Arab Spring or the uprising, that this power struggle that is going to emerge, given the age of the monarchs, given the age of the families of the Saudi royal family, the members of the Saudi royal family, that that will maybe lead to some kind of change in Saudi Arabia. So can I have your reaction to what will happen? Let's pretend and fast forward 5, 6, 7 years from now, when they're going to be, well, in their 80s and 90s, or when they start passing away, in terms of how this is going to be passed on, to whom it's going to be passed on, and of course, are things going to change? Is that the only scenario that things that might point towards changes in Saudi Arabia?
Well, certainly there will be a change to almost totally different generation, a generation who they can speak good English, who have lived in the West, and have been influenced with the modern way of life, so they're going to bring modernity to Saudi Arabia. As far as division inside the royal family of Saudi Arabia, I doubt very much so, because for one thing, the very, very rich, the family itself and the country, and the second thing, they are reasonably in harmony, and is a very well disciplined tribe or royal family. So I think it will be very difficult to look at a split in the royal family itself, because I think when it comes to hierarchy, it's reasonably settled who is going to be the next king, and I would imagine that's not going to be the major problem. The major problem is between the people and the royal family, between the east and the west of the kingdom, between what happened in the Yemeni border and what happened inside the Arabia, between what happened in the Middle East, between modernizing the Islamic thinking and the way of the Orthodox way of thinking in Saudi Arabia.
Well, that's one thing that I'm curious as to what Saudi Arabia is doing, Nabil Mikhail. Let's look at Saudi Arabia. There were reports that, aside from them going into Bahrain, that they're actually thinking of virtually annexing Bahrain and building this missile naval base. We have seen that they are in the lead for this PGCC mediation effort, which is backed by the United States. So looking at the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council and its function there, it seems like they're taking the matters into their own hands. Is that how you see it in terms of trying to maintain the uprisings that are occurring not only within but around them?
In the case of the uprisings taking place in the Arab world, there are two attitudes. Is that America and the West can get involved, something similar to what happened in Egypt and Libya, but in Libya the situation is basically tense. The other thing is to delegate responsibility to other countries, like for instance the Gulf Cooperation Council is taking the lead in the case of Bahrain and in the case of Yemen. So this is basically the broad division of labor between America, the West, and nations in the Middle East, and also can find that the nations that where uprisings happen are also trying to stabilize the situation in others. There is concern about the situation in Syria on the part of Egypt, and also somehow the Egyptians were able to organize the reconciliation with the Palestinians. But the problem is that the momentum of the uprising is going on. It's now being institutionalized. The United States sometimes has plans, sometimes does not. Actually, in most of the cases, the United States does not have plans. So it's a very dynamic situation, and it will touch every country in the region.
Okay.
But I believe that
unfortunately, Nabil Mikhail, we've ran out of time. I am sorry. Thanks for your statements, political analyst Nabil Mikhail, and also Wafiq Mustafa. Thank you. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned. In a few minutes' time, we have international news for you.